Hello! In this video, we're going to learn about functions and dictionaries. We're first going to learn how to create a dictionary and then how to retrieve dictionary values using a key. We'll learn how to use the .get function to retrieve dictionary values as well. Then we'll learn how to define our own functions. We'll learn how to specify and use arguments, as well as how to use argument defaults, and how to change the order of arguments when using a function that we've created. We'll also learn about how to retrieve function outputs, and we'll learn how to use return to store variables, and also how to use yield as a generator. So let's get started. In this cell, which should be provided in your notebook, is a dictionary that's already written. It's called genetic code, and it is the genetic code. The genetic code is perfect for learning about dictionaries. Every 3 nucleotides of DNA can encode a amino acid. DNA is transcribed into messenger RNA, and that messenger RNA is translated into the amino acids. So we have these keys. The keys are the codons, which are a sequence of 3 nucleotides each. For each of these keys, each one of these keys will specify a particular amino acid, which is the value. So what a dictionary is it's a series of keys and their associated values. Dictionaries are really useful to look things up. And so what we're going to do for this first exercise is giving a coding sequence of DNA, like green fluorescent protein, which is a fluorescent protein from jellyfish that's often used as a reporter gene, or the coding sequence of Rubisco, which is one of the most abundantly expressed proteins on the planet that is used to fix carbon. We will look at each of the codons in these sequences, every 3 nucleotides, and we'll be using our dictionary to use the key to look up its associated value so that we can translate these DNA sequences into a protein sequence. But just so that we're very clear about what the structure of a dictionary is a lot like a list, except now we have to deal with all these keys and their associated values. So unlike a list, a dictionary is specified by the curly brackets. And then we create these key and value pairs. So if we had key 1, we write the key, but then it's a colon that is in between the key and its associated value. And then we usually have multiple keys and multiple associated values. So you would just put a comma, specify your next key, colon, and then put its value too. So there you go. You have a dictionary. And that dictionary for the genetic code is already provided, and you should check it out in this cell. So to retrieve a value in a dictionary, it's a lot like indexing, but we can use the key. So if we want to retrieve a particular value, we call up a particular key. So let's say that the key, we want to know what amino acid is associated with the codon ATG. So we use the square brackets, which is a lot like indexing, but instead of a number, we can put a value, which is the key itself. Oh, we didn't execute our cell. And there we go. We can see that if we call the key of a dictionary ATG, which is the starting sequence of a protein, which is also methionine. And that's what it returns. Let's try this one more time with our genetic code. Let's say we wanted to know what TAG was. And that's not an amino acid. That is a stop codon. We can just specify the key itself, but there's also a function to go about this too. So we can say genetic code, and we can use the .get function. And within the .get function, we put a codon or a key. And so in the .get function, we put a key, and we retrieve the value back. So the codon TTT is phenylalanine. And let's try the get function one more time, .get, and maybe we're curious about what TAA is. And there you go. That is a different type of stop codon. So we can use either the key itself, a lot like indexing, to look up the associated values in a dictionary, or we can use a function like .get, where we put in the value and we get the key and we get the value back. So we can use this, of course, in useful ways. Let's say that we wanted to create a for loop and we wanted to translate our DNA sequences of GFP and Rubisco into a protein. So let's create a empty list, and we're going to call it protein. And we want to go through these DNA sequences for GFP. We want to go through each codon one by one. So we're going to say for I in range for the length of our coding sequence of GFP. But we don't necessarily want the actual length. We want its length divided by 3, because every 3 characters of GFP gives us a codon. And also notice that we are using this awkward double division sign. This is called floor division. It's also called integer division. And what this does is it forces the output of this to be an integer. So that we input an integer into range, which is iterated over. So we're going over the range. We're going to look at each of the 3 characters, the codons, for the coding sequence of GFP. And so for each of these, we'll call it a codon, and it will be the GFP coding sequence, and we're going to index this. It will be I times 3, where I starts at 0, and then it would be 1, so then it would be 3, and then it would be 2, and so then it would be 6. And we're going to go to I times 3 plus 3. So if this I were 0, at first we would go from 0 to 2. And then we would go from 3 to 5. And then we would go from 6 to 8. So we're going in triplets to look at every single codon. And then if we have a codon, we can get our amino acid. So our amino acid is going to be the genetic code, and we're going to use .get. And we're going to look up the key codon. You can put another kind of safeguard into this function. You can say, if you can't find a key that matches what you're looking for, what do you put in its place? So if we can't find what we're looking for, we're just going to put the codon itself. But we should be able to find every single codon. We're going to look up the codon value as a key in our dictionary genetic code, and we're going to return the value, the amino acid, back. So we get our codon, we get our amino acid by using the dictionary and using the codon as a key, and then we have our first amino acid that has been translated. So we will append to our protein sequence amino acid. And then at the very end, for our protein list of all those amino acids, we want them to all be one string, just like a protein is. It's not like it's separate amino acids. So we're going to use something called the join function. You can put in a separator. We're just going to put an underscore. And we will join all the elements of protein, the list, together to create a giant string called protein. So if we do that, and we look at what protein is, there we go. We started with this giant DNA sequence here, and looking up every 3 nucleotides, every codon, and looking up the genetic code as a dictionary. We looked up each amino acid, stored them in a list, and then we separated them by an underscore. And so that's one utility of a dictionary. If you have a series of things, in this case, a series of characters in a string, codons of DNA, you can look them up one by one and find their associated values. And in this case, translate a DNA sequence into protein. But we probably want to take this, we want to generalize this. We have a Rubisco sequence, for example. What if we have other DNA sequences that we want to have translated? And this is where the second part of our lesson becomes very useful, which is functions. So there probably are functions and other Python packages and modules that allow you to translate DNA sequences, but sometimes you won't be able to find what you need. And in that case, you need to write your own function. So let's take what we just did, our function, Actually, let's just store it in the cell below temporarily. But we want to write a function so that, and we're going to call it translate, that we can take any DNA sequence and immediately make a protein sequence. So when we define a function, we start with DEF. That's the very first thing you do to define a function, DEF. And this first line, just like for loops or while loops, is very important. In this first line, we start with DEF. We give our function our name. Our function is going to be called translate. And then, as you've seen, functions, they take arguments. They take inputs. And here on the first line of your function that you're defining, you give the function the inputs that you would like it to have. So let's make the first input DNA. We need a DNA sequence. And then the second input will be a dictionary. Notice at this point, Python, these are just variable names. These variables, they could be numbers, they could be lists, they could be dictionaries. Python at this point doesn't know, and you'll be using these values when you define your function in the body of the function itself, but just put the inputs and the names you want to define them as you would like in this first line. So we need a DNA sequence, and we need something, we need a dictionary to interpret it. So we have DNA, dictionary. Something else you can do in a function is you can specify a default value. So the genetic code is pretty much standard. It's more or less the same for most of the organisms and most contexts on the Earth. So the genetic code dictionary we already have is a good dictionary. So we can set that, if we're going to call our genetic code, we can set it as a default for our dictionary value. So if we don't specify a dictionary, the function will know to use the genetic code already. So that's the first line. It starts with DEF. You name your function whatever you want to be, in this case, translate. And then you provide a number of arguments or inputs. And you can give them whatever name you want, and we'll be using these variable names in our code for our function. So now you can pretty much just take the function as it is and put it into the function you're defining. So it's important to indent everything properly. And so we'll start by creating an empty list called protein. Then we'll have our for loop, for I in range. And now it's important that we don't use GFP because our function won't know what GFP is, but it will know what DNA is. So we set the arguments that we want, but we subsequently use them as variable names when we're defining our function. So for I in range of length DNA divided by 3, we find our first codon. Again, we have to change this to the variable name, which will be DNA. Then we look for our amino acid. And so we go to now not genetic code, even though that's the default, but rather we go to dictionary. So for I in range, DNA, code DNA, amino acid, we look up in our dictionary, which will be by default genetic code, and then we get what the codon is. And then we append to the list protein whatever the amino acid is. And in the end, we join all of the elements of our list protein into a single protein. The last thing you need to do is you somehow need to get back whatever you've done in the function. You can just use a lot of the functions that we have been using to retrieve outputs. For example, print will work. What will happen is you'll run your function, and when you run your function, it will print what the protein is. We're going to look at more sophisticated ways to get outputs of your function later. These are return and yield, but you can print, you can plot, you can use all of these functions that have outputs in your own custom function to retrieve an output. So we shift enter, we execute this cell, and now we should have a function called translate. So let's give it a shot. So we have this function we've just made, we call it up like any other function. It has parentheses. And the most default way to use a function, and we're going to talk about how we use our arguments in just a second, is to actually just put the argument names by copy and paste and then fill it out. So let's say we want our DNA to be GFP and we want our dictionary to be genetic code. So we press Shift Enter, and then there you go. There is a print output of the amino acid sequence of GFP. So you notice when we did this that we have to provide a DNA sequence, we have to provide a dictionary sequence, except by default the dictionary sequence is genetic code. So for default, if you set one, what happens is if you don't specify what the dictionary is, it will assume that it's genetic code. And note here that we're not saying DNA equals. We're just going to put GFP. So just by putting GFP, Python is smart enough to know that the default dictionary is genetic code. It knows it needs a single DNA sequence, so we don't need to put DNA equals. We can just put GFP. And if we press Shift Enter, there we go. We get to the amino acid sequence of GFP. And the utility of defining your own functions is that rather than that loop that we made, that was a lot of lines of code to get a codon, an amino acid, and append those to lists, that now with just one line, we can call up this function. And if we have other DNA sequences, all we have to do is just provide a DNA sequence. So maybe we don't want GFP, maybe we want Rubisco. And there we go. We have the protein sequence of Rubisco, which is a much longer protein than GFP. So this, without specifying what things are, can only go so far. So, for example, you can't just put things out of order. So if I put two things, genetic code, well, let's do it the correct way first. Without saying what things are, in this particular order, Python knows that this is a DNA sequence and that the second is a dictionary, and it works. But we can't do, Python is not smart enough if you do something like this. What will happen is it's assuming that this is a DNA sequence, but it's a dictionary, and the DNA sequence is where the dictionary is, and that's going to create some sort of error, and the code just won't work. But you can have this order as long as you specify what things are. So if we want things out of order, that's fine. We just have to give Python a heads up. So we can say dictionary equals genetic code in the first position, and then we can say DNA equals GFP in the second position. And this will work because we have very clearly told Python which, even though they're out of order, that this particular argument in this position is the dictionary, and this argument in this position is in the DNA. If we don't do that, it assumes that the first position is the DNA and the second position is the dictionary. So that's a little bit about defaults. We can specify a default. If you specify a default and don't specify the argument subsequently when you call your function, it will assume the value is the default. Order is important. If you don't specify what the arguments are with an equal sign, they better be in order, because if they're out of order, Python will either misinterpret or you'll run into an error. So that's a little bit about how to create a function and how to run your own function then. Let's do this a little more. Let's copy and paste the function that we just wrote for translate. And let's explore different ways to get outputs from our function. So I think we all understand that what was happening is we defined this function, and then when we run this function, it prints out what the protein is. That's not necessarily useful though. What if you wanted to use the protein sequence as a variable for something else? Printing it out really doesn't help you. So there's another very common call that we use in our functions called return. So let's see what return is going to do. If we just call our function, it will seem that it's working very similarly as print, but it's not. This is not a print statement. This is an output, as you can see here by this red lettering output. this is not a print statement, and it's a little different than that. So what a return statement does is it allows us to what we call catch our variables. And what that means is that you can create a variable and set it equal to the output of the function. So if we create a new variable, we're going to call it GFP protein. We're going to call our function. It's going to translate the GFP coding sequence, but our function translate doesn't print anymore, it returns. And so if we do that, what happens is you can see now if we look at what GFP protein is, it is the output. So we have stored, we have caught, we have kept the output of translate using the return functionality. And that's very useful because as much as you have DNA sequences, maybe you want a bunch of separate protein variables to store your protein sequences too. So we can, just like we have a variable GFP protein, we can create a variable Rubisco protein, and now we have this variable forevermore in this variable Rubisco protein. We have the actual sequence. So that's how we use return. Return is very common. Return is being used by most of the functions that you're using in Python. And what it does is it doesn't print something out. What it does instead is that you can then store and pass on the outputs of the function you define into a variable. And then using that variable, you can do whatever you need to do. So that's an introduction to functions and dictionaries using the genetic code. Let's look at what we're going to be looking at today, which is something called LSystems. LSystems are named after Lindenmayer. He was studying a cyanobacteria called Anabaena. Anabaena is a filamentous cyanobacteria. It looks like kind of like a string of pearls. And that string, that filamentous morphology of this cyanobacteria Anabaena is caused by distinct cell types. And it's very simple. There's only two types of cells, A and B. And these cells, they divide in a line to create the filamentous structure using only two cell types. And there's a set of rules about how these cells divide. And so Lindenmayer created a very simple, elegant, and powerful mathematical system to describe this phenomena of Anabaena called LSystems. And we're going to be using LSystems to model the branching architectures of plants and model plants in all sorts of ways. It's a very flexible mathematical form. But at its core, what LSystems is doing is it always takes an axiom of some sort. And everything about LSystems is very character-based. So the axiom will be a character. We're just going to start with A. And then there's an axiom, but then there's things called production rules. And these is just a set of rules. And this is why we're learning about dictionaries, because here dictionaries are very useful. And these rules, they rewrite the original sequence. So the first rule for this Anabaena cyanobacteria is that A, if you start with A, that A will be transformed into AB. If you have B, that B will be transformed into A. So if we start with A, we do one iteration, and we would get AB. And so now we have AB. And so the first character of AB is A, so it goes to AB. And then the second character is A, so it would go to A. And so then you would have, after the second iteration, A, B, A. And it would go on and on and on. But you can see why this is really useful for coding. So one of the lines of code that's very elegant and useful that we're going to be using in this notebook is this here. So let's just write this out. And what this is going to do is that, and you haven't seen this single line notation for a for loop yet, but it's just like a for loop. And what it is for C in axiom, which is for each character in the string axiom. For each character in the string axiom, we're going to use the dictionary rules. And as you just saw from rules, we're going to look up the character in axiom as a key. And we're going to return the value from the dictionary of that key for that character in axiom. Then we're going to go to the next character and the next character after that. And then for all of these lookups in the dictionary, for each character of axiom that is rewritten using the rules dictionary, we're going to join those all together just like we did with our protein. But instead of an underscore separating each of the elements, we're going to put nothing. So we have A, we have the dictionary that tells us A should go to AB. If we run this line of code, we should get AB back. If instead our axiom was B, we would get A back because that's what B is. Let's say that instead we start with ABBA. And if we start with ABBA, we get AB, AAAB back. So let's go over this just once. So A went to AB, B and B went to A and A, and then A went to AB. So that's how we use the rules to rewrite each character one by one and transform ABBA into AB, AAA, B. So as you're going to see in this notebook, we're going to create all sorts of functions. You should get just used to making function after function. You should get used to making a function and then using the function you just made in another function that you made yourself as well. There is no shame in making functions upon functions. So let's get in this habit. And functions don't have to be that involved. They can be a lot of simple code. So what we just did was, let's call it a single transform. It's just one, we take one axiom, one rewriting, and get something back. And our arguments for our function single transform, we'll need an axiom and we'll need some rules. And then because we've reduced everything to a single line here, we can just simply return that value. So we have now a function single transform. Let's create a variable, and we set it equal to single transform. And we have our axiom already, ABBA, and we have our rules already too. So if we do that, and then we look at, well, what was the variable? It was ABAAB. So our function single transform works. Now let's just turn around and turn this into another function too. Let's say that we wanted to transform ABAAB again. So let's create a function called multiple transform. Our function single transform will only just keep on spitting back outputs from one transform, and then we have to call it again and again. But let's say if we had a given sequence, an axiom, and we have a set of rules, and we have a number of iterations. How many times do we want to keep on calling this function? For this example of the Anabaena cyanobacteria, Lindenmayer also noticed some very interesting properties about the lengths of the strings that keep on coming back. So we're going to create in this function an empty list called lengths, and then we're going to say for I in range iterations. So for the number of iterations, we're going to rewrite the sequence. This term rewriting we use a lot. It's at the heart of LSystems. We keep on rewriting sequences. So we'll use our single transform, and it will take in the sequence. And then using the rules, it will rewrite the actual variable sequence itself. So sequence comes in as one thing. We use rules to rewrite it, and the value of sequence is reset to the transformed value. Let's get the length of this sequence. Every time we create a new iteration, every time we transform and rewrite this sequence, let's get the length of the new sequence. So to this list lengths, we're going to append the length of the new sequence value that we just created. Now let's use a lot of the tricks we've learned for outputs. Let's print the sequence. We want to see what we're at each step, what the sequence was. But we also want to return things back to us. So let's return sequence. So by this time, it's going to be the final sequence. And let's return the list lengths. So let's stop and try to anticipate what this function is going to do. It's doing a lot of things, and it's meant to show you all the bells and whistles of how functions work and how we retrieve the outputs. So it's at the heart of this is this single transform. This iterates once. It takes, for one time, actually there should be a comma there. It takes an input sequence, an axiom, and using a set of rules, it will spit back, it will return a new sequence value. We're just going to overwrite the original sequence value. This is acting as an axiom, a beginning sequence itself that we provide multiple transforms. We rewrite over sequence for the number of iterations. So we're going to go rewrite once, twice, thrice, and then we're going to keep on doing it until we reach the number of iterations that we want to. We're keeping track of the length of each time we rewrite sequence. So the value of sequence is changing with each iteration. We're getting the length of the sequence each time, and we're actually going to print it each time when we call this function up, it's going to call this for loop, and each time this for loop runs, it's going to print back the new sequence value to us. So no matter what, when we run this function, we're going to have printed to us the value of the sequence at each iteration. But at the end of this function, after the entire for loop, we're then going to return sequence, which will be a single final sequence value. And we're also going to return this list of lengths. Notice that the way that you specify you can return any number of things that you want. But the way that you do it is you specify something, comma, and then you put the next thing. So let's run that. There we go. So shift enter, we have defined our multiple transform function. And so let's try multiple transform. So this is our axiom. Our beginning sequence is going to be A. We have a set of rules, and let's go 10 times for this. So A goes to AB, this goes to AB and A, and so on for 10 times. These are print statements that run every single time the for loop runs. That was triggered by running this function. But we also, remember, had these two things that are returned, sequence and lengths. And so these are not print outputs. It's just because we didn't catch these variables, Python is just showing us what they were. And so if we ran this properly, we would actually catch these two variables. So the way you capture the outputs of a function, multiple outputs, is just like you're returning these multiple outputs and they're separated by a comma. You can catch them with whatever name you want also by creating two variable names separated by a comma. And then we're going to run the function the exact same way. And if we do that, again, we're getting this print statement of what the sequence was at each step. But notice now we don't have these outputs. And the reason is because we have captured these outputs in these two different variables that we specified. So the variable sequence that we created now has the value of the final string. And if we look at lengths, the list, that is an output too. And you can see that the reason we wanted to do this is because the length of each of the outputs is the Fibonacci sequence. So 2 plus 3 equals 5, 3 plus 5 equals 8, 5 plus 8 equals 13, 8 plus 13 equals 21. 13 plus 21 equals 34. And you learned about this when you were studying phyllotaxy with sunflowers. And so that was another interesting mathematical property about these LSystems and the Anabaena cyanobacteria of Lindenmayer, that with each subsequent iteration, it recapitulates the Fibonacci sequence. So this was about, we created a function. Using a function we created, we used the return output to return multiple outputs. So now you know how to use print or something like plot to create an output. You know how to use return to make multiple outputs. But let's learn about one more way to capture an output from a function. And so let's use a very similar function to multiple transforms, but we're going to call it yield transform. So given a sequence, rules, and iteration, for I in range iteration, we'll use our single transform for the sequence and the rules, and we'll keep on rewriting sequence, and we're not going to do the lengths or the Fibonacci sequence this time. But instead of printing the statement, we're going to yield the statement. So notice that the print statement was put into the for loop. And so when we called the function, it starts running this for loop, but every time the for loop iterates, it prints out the sequence. And so we're doing the same with yield. Yield is a lot like return, except that it's something called a generator. So it creates values on the fly, and they're meant only to be used once. But notice that we're yielding this output, which is the length of the sequence with each time we go over the loop. So we're going to run this function. It's going to run the for loop. And every time we run this for loop, it's going to create an output, this yield. And we somehow need to catch this yield, but it keeps on generating this. It'll just create sequence after sequence after sequence, but it's not printing them out. So what happens to them? So we're trying to yield these lengths of each of the sequences. So if we use our function yield transform, and we set the axiom, it is the sequence equal to A, and we have a set of rules, and we're going to go for 10 iterations. One second. There we go. So we have a sequence, we have rules, we have iterations, and this is the output, a generator object from yield transform. That's not a print statement. It's not a returned object. What is this? This is not of much use to us. We can try to catch it as a variable. So let's create a variable, and we're going to set it equal to this function. If this were like a return statement, what would happen is that the variable would now have the lengths, but it doesn't. Again, we have this generator object. So what yield is doing is when we call the function, it goes into the for loop that we've specified, and it's yielding. It's giving us back this output every single time this for loop is running, but we kind of like catching it into a variable, but that's not the appropriate way to use this, this value. So yield it yields something known as a generator. Generators are, they're spit out, and they're meant to be used once. They're ideally used if you're somehow like iterating over them or using them as they come out. One of the best ways to use a yield statement is in a for loop. So kind of like range, where you iterate over a set of numbers that range produces, but you couldn't use range in the same way that you use other functions to just create values that start at 0 and go up to a certain number. They're meant to be iterated over. So you can do just that. You can say for I, and you can just put our function, because what our function is going to do is it's going to be spitting outputs back to I. So you can do something with I then. So if you say for I in our function, where our function is going to be putting back these generator outputs from yield over and over again, if we say print I, that works. This is the Fibonacci sequence, just as we expected. We're yielding the length of the Fibonacci sequence. But as we saw, we couldn't catch these values into a variable. Yield in this sense is meant to be something that is iterated over. It can also be used just directly into another function. So this is actually how we're going to be using yield in this notebook. It's going to be as a output to be plotted. So let's import matplotlib as plt, and let's do our inline as well. Okay, now we can plot. We could say, for example, plt.plot, and let's create as a list capturing the yields of this function that we've made. So yield is going to start working with every iteration of the, oh, 1 second. Let me get my parentheses right. There we go. When we call this yield transform function, it's going to go in a for loop. The for loop is going to yield the lengths of each of the sequences each time. We're going to create a list, and that's going to be plotted. So if we do that, you can see that we capture the values, the lengths of the sequence. So you're going to be using yield to create LSystems, where you're going to have a string, and the strings are going to be directing the activity of a turtle. And you're going to be learning about the turtle in this lesson. It's where a string is interpreted as directions for a cursor, the turtle, to have an angle or a positional value. And what's going to happen is we're going to yield the coordinates back, and then you can plot them. But yield is just another way that you can create outputs from your function. So what did we learn today? We learned about dictionaries and functions. You learned how to create a dictionary with the curly brackets, and you have a key, and each key is separated from a value by a colon, and each of the key value pairs is separated by a comma, all within these curly brackets. We learned that a lot like you index a list, you can index a dictionary, but you can use the key value itself to return the associated value. You can also do this same thing using the get function, putting the key value in the get function, and it will give you back the value. We learned how to define your own function. You start with def, you give your function a name, you use parentheses, and you put a series of arguments into your function. Once you create your function, you can use the arguments in a lot of different ways. You can change the order of the arguments, but sometimes you will need to make sure that you specify which argument is which when you change the order. You can also specify defaults for functions, and the default value, if you don't specify any argument value when you use your function, it will go straight to default. We learned about a number of function outputs. Function outputs can be as simple as using print statements or even plotting functions. But we also learned about return, and return allows us to capture our variables, our outputs in a variable that we create. So we store the outputs of our function in a variable. We can use the variable later for other purposes. And we also learned about yield, which is a generator. And generators produce values to be used only once. They can be used kind of being generated on the fly to iterate over in a for loop, or they can also be directly passed to other functions for plotting or whatever purposes you might have. So that's all for this video. Thanks for watching.